Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 723, and today is December 6th, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. We have a good amount of news to get through for a Friday, so I'm going to hop right into it. Just want to ask people once again to subscribe to the brand new Kyle Anzalone show. I basically take what I'm doing here on Conflicts of Interest and turn it into a far higher quality product. I have a production team behind me for the Kyle Anzalone show, and it would really help us if you head on over to the page and subscribe. It is the first link in the show notes page, so wherever you're listening, very easy to just click on the Kyle Anzalone show and subscribe to the YouTube page. Last episode, and sorry about doing, and we had like 50 subscribers in the hours after. So if we could continue to just add a few hundred people every couple of days, we're going to very quickly get to that 1,000 subscriber mark, and we could start doing some monetization and stuff down that road too. So help us get there. I certainly have a large enough audience here at Conflicts of Interest that even if not even large portion of you go on over and subscribe, we would hit that 1,000 mark. So if you can contribute and help us get there, and check out the Kyle Anzalone show. But for now, we got another episode of Conflicts of Interest here. All right, so starting off with this from the Wall Street Journal, the Navy struggles to reload its missile launching ships. And so this is what was written in the Wall Street Journal. A U.S. Navy destroyer could fire dozens of cruise missiles within minutes. Reloading the deadly warship back in port can take 2 months. In a war against China, that could be a weakness. Until recently, the Navy did not feel much need for speed in rearming its biggest missile firing warships, the only occasionally large number of Tomahawk missiles or other pricey projectiles. So get this. This is one of the more unbelievable sentences that I have read in the past few months, where they say, until recently, the Navy didn't feel much need for speed in rearming its biggest missile firing warships. And so it's not as if they aren't planning fighting a war with China or Russia, right? It's until recently. What's recently? The past 10 years? How could they possibly think that they could have all their ships returned to port to restock their cruise missiles? This is absolutely insane. But apparently this is just how it works in the Pentagon. So now Pentagon strategists worry that if fighting broke out in the Western Pacific, potentially 5,000 miles from a secure Navy base, destroyers, cruisers, and other big warships could run out of vital ammunition within days or maybe hours. Seeking to plug that supply gap, Carlos Del Toro, the head of the Navy, tasked commanders and engineers with finding a way to reload the fleet's launch systems at remote ports or even on the high seas. Otherwise, U.S. ships may need to sail back to bases in Hawaii or California to do so, putting them out of action for weeks. So the reloading has been causing the Navy headaches in the Red Sea. Warships deployed there to defend cargo ships from the Houthis in Yemen must sail through the Suez Canal to ports in Greece and Spain to reload, leaving the fights for extended periods. And so it's not even if we're talking about potential future war with Russia or China, even fighting the Houthis, one of the most isolated groups in the world. This band in Yemen that, yeah, they've been able to control a large portion of the country's population and to govern for some years now, almost a decade. And that's, not to say that this is just some band of rebels in the north of Yemen, but it isn't a true state military that the U.S. is fighting in Yemen, and yet we are having these problems already. So it's just striking how incompetent the U.S. military could possibly be, and how it's just openly reported in our media, and something like that doesn't cause massive outrage and upheaval, right? You would think that the conservatives are really so concerned about fighting a future war with China that we would be really, really upset with our Pentagon, with our Department of Defense, if they are completely unable to fight that war that they have been provoking, and yet that's not at all a concern. All right, next up here, let's get into some news about the war in Ukraine. We're going to start off here with one from Dave DeCamp. Canadian government bans more types of guns and wants to send them to Ukraine. The Canadian government on Thursday said that it was prohibiting citizens from owning another 324 types of firearms and is working to send them to Ukraine. As a part of its comprehensive approach on December 5th, 2024, the government of prohibition announced the prohibition of more military-style assault rifle-style firearms, the Canadian Public Safety Department said in a press release. Adding amendments to the classification regulations have resulted in the prohibition of 102 families of firearms encompassing 324 unique makes and models. The Canadians who own the newly banned guns have an amnesty until October 30th, 2025. During that time, the government will implement a buyback program. The Canadian Defense Minister Bill Blair said that the government is in talks with Ukraine about sending them the firearms. We've been working very closely with our friends in Ukraine to ensure that the weapons that were intended to be used in conflict could be made available to them. So Blair added, the Department of National Defense will begin working with the Canadian companies that have weapons that Ukraine needs, which are already eligible for the assault-style firearm compensation program, in order to get these weapons out of Canada and into the hands of Ukrainians. And so this is insane. I think the city of Miami did this at one point in the war. It seems more to be just something that government officials think of that sounds like a good idea that's going to catch a few headlines, but practically I can't imagine that this helps the Ukrainians in any way. And it's just additional propaganda to help the gun grabbers in Ottawa. All right, next up here, Amnesty International declares Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza. So the statement from the really renowned human rights group said, Amnesty International's research have found significant basis to conclude that Israel has committed and is continuing to commit genocide against the Palestinians in the occupied Gaza Strip, the organization said in a new landmark report published today. Amnesty International examined Israel's acts in Gaza closely and in their totality, taking into account their reoccurrence and simultaneous occurrences, and both in their immediate impact and their cumulative and mutually reinforcing consequences. The organization considers the scale and severity of the casualties and the destruction over time. It also analyzed public statements by officials, finding that prohibited acts were often announced or called for in the first place by high-level officials in charge of the war effort. Israel imposed conditions of life in Gaza that created a deadly mixture of malnutrition, hunger, and disease, and exposed Palestinians to a slow, calculated death. Israel also subjected hundreds of Palestinians from Gaza to incommunicado detention, torture, and other ill treatment. Viewed in isolation, some of these acts investigated by Amnesty International constitute serious violations of international humanitarian law or international human rights law. But in looking at the broader picture of Israel's military campaign and the cumulative impacts of the policies and acts, genocidal intent is the only reasonable conclusion. Before reaching its conclusion, Amnesty International examined Israel's claims that its military lawfully targeted Hamas and other armed groups throughout Gaza, and the resulting unprecedented destruction and denial of aid were outcomes of the unlawful conduct by Hamas and other armed groups, such as local fighting among the civilian population or diversion of aid. The organization concluded that these claims are not credible. The presence of Hamas fighters near or within the densely populated areas does not absolve Israel of its obligations to take all feasible precautions to spare civilians and avoid indiscriminate or disproportionate attacks. Its research found Israel repeatedly failed to do so, committing multiple crimes under international law for which there can be no justification based on Hamas's actions. Amnesty International also found no evidence that the diversion of aid could be explained by Israel's extreme and deliberate restrictions on life-saving humanitarian aid. In its analysis, the organization also considered alternative arguments, such as ones that Israel was acting recklessly or that it simply wanted to destroy Hamas and did not care if it destroyed Palestinians in the process, demonstrating a callous disregard for the lives rather than genocidal intent. However, regardless of Whether Israel sees the destruction of Palestinians as an instrumental to destroying Hamas or an acceptable byproduct of the goal, this view of Palestinians as disposable and not worthy of consideration is in itself evidence of genocidal intent. Many of the unlawful acts documented by Amnesty International were preceded by officials urging their implementation. The organization viewed 102 statements that were issued by the Israeli government and military officials between October 7, 2023 and June 30th, 2024, and dehumanizing Palestinians, called for or justified genocidal acts or other crimes against them. Of these, Amnesty International identified 22 statements made by senior officials in charge of managing the offensive that appeared to call for or justify genocidal acts, providing them direct evidence of genocidal intent. And so what this report is saying is that they've found at least, and this is only in the first 8 months of the war, and so there's another 6 months of the war to review now. They found at least 22 statements by high-ranking senior officials, and so we're talking about Netanyahu, Gallant, Israel Katz, other top officials. This isn't necessarily just some minister of the Likud party. These are the top senior officials who are actually in front of the war effort. And on 22 occasions, they made statements that openly called for genocidal acts. And so Yoav Gallant saying that we're not going to allow any aid into Gaza. Netanyahu saying treat the people of Gaza like Amalek, right? These kinds of statements are clearly statements that call for genocide, and it's happened 22 times. And you know what? Maybe the more amazing part of it is that the U.S. government hasn't done anything to respond to any of these statements, even by the upper ranks of the Israeli leadership. And remember, there's 102 statements when we start to talk about, other ministers, and the Minister of Women Affairs or something like that is calling for a genocide in Gaza, which is just a horrific thing to think through in itself. But, those aren't counted in these 22 that they're talking about. These are the high-ranking military officials, Netanyahu, these people who are really in charge of policy, who are frequently calling for acts that either call for or justify genocide. So the last little bit from the Amnesty report I had here, this language was frequently replicated, including by Israeli soldiers on the ground, as evidenced by audio content verified by Amnesty International, showing soldiers making the call to erase Gaza, to make it uninhabitable, and celebrating the destruction of Palestinian homes, mosques, schools, and universities. And so it's not just that Netanyahu said, we are going to go into Gaza and treat the people like Amalek. It's that the soldiers, once they heard that, were on the ground talking about how they're conducting Amalek-like genocide in Gaza. And so, in some ways here, the guilt is so overwhelming. They got the Israelis, the Americans, dead to rights on this, right? The Israelis have been so vocal about how they're willing to and open to conducting a genocide, not just some military campaign, but a full true genocide is what we're talking about here, right? That's what the Israelis are doing, and the Americans have bet them all the way these 14 months. It's so disgusting. It's so frustrating. And again, one of the only things to say here is that at the very least they've been so open about their cruelty and have been just openly bragged about how much they hate and they're willing to kill these Palestinian people, that the only upside is they've just been so open about that history will remember that these people were genocidal monsters, and Washington knew it at the time and bat them anyways. But, it's so horrific. All right, let's move on now. And this war does have a lot of kind of repercussions back home, in the sense of we're losing our freedoms as our government works to protect Israel's genocidal leaders. And so this one from Dave DeCamp, December 2nd, antiwar.com. U.S. Zionist group targets pro-Palestinian protesters with facial recognition in hopes Trump will deport them. The American branch of the global Badar Zionist movement is using facial recognition technology with artificial intelligence to identify foreign students who have attended attended pro-Palestinian protests and hopes then President-elect Donald Trump will deport them when he comes into office. Ross Glick, the head of the U.S.'s branch of the organization, said the foreign students on visas in the U.S. shouldn't have the right to free speech. So he said, according to the Times of Israel, even many of the protesters engaging in peaceful activities are a part of front groups that are trying to undermine America and Israel. We believe in the freedom of speech, but if a foreign student is here on a visa, they don't have the same rights as others to protest or to promote anti-Zionist narratives. And this isn't true. The Bill of Rights extends to anybody who's in the United States of America, or I think probably actually in the detention of Americans. And so, for example, the people say that are, the terrorists who are left in Guantanamo Bay, they should have had the rights of the Bill of Rights. Now, that doesn't mean that they're innocent and that they should have been let go, just that, they had the right to a trial and not to be tortured and things like that. So Glick said his organization has identified dozens of students from Canada, the UK, and several Arab countries that will be reported to the Trump administration. The process involves identifying people through video footage, then looking into them online. He said the next step is waiting until Trump's inauguration on January 20th, and then we hand over the information. President Trump has said he would deport foreign students for taking part in pro-Palestinian protests, which he and many other Israeli supporters have falsely labeled anti-Semitic, despite Jewish students and organizations being heavily involved in the demonstrations. So Trump said back in May, "When I'm president, we will not allow colleges to be taken over by violent radicals. If you come here from another country and try to bring jihadists or anti-Americanism or anti-Semitism to our campuses, we will immediately deport you. You'll be out of that school." So Glick said his organization has been working with members of Congress, including Ted Cruz, a Republican, and John Fetterman, a Democrat, to ensure protesters are rounded up as soon as Trump comes into office. Trump has vowed to crack down on pro-Palestinian protests after going on at colleges. And so he said in September, "Here's what I will do to defeat anti-Semitism and to defend our Jewish citizens of America. My first week back in the Oval Office, my administration will inform every college president, if you do not end anti-Semitic propaganda, then they will lose their federal taxpayer support." And of course, while I'm not a big fan of these institutions gained a bunch of free taxpayer dollars, at the same time, you got to look at this situation and understand that the limits on free speech only go one way. And so this is a real act of trampling on the First Amendment by Donald Trump. All right, let's move on to Syria now. Russia accuses Ukraine of supporting al-Qaeda-linked fighters in Syria. So on Tuesday, Russian ambassador to the UN, Vasily Nebenzia, accused Ukraine of supporting militants in Syria fighting under the command of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, an al-Qaeda offshoot that has led to the takeover of Aleppo. The accusation came a few days after the Kiev Post reported the Islamist group based in Idlib that are taking part in the offensive have received training from the Kishmik group, a special unit of Ukraine's main intelligence directorate. So Ukrainian military instructors from the GRU are present, training HTS fighters for the combat operations, the Russian official said. He added that HTF has not only concealed the fact that they are supported by Ukraine, but they are openly flaunting this. So the Kiev Post cited posts on Islamist social media sites that said the GRU has trained HTS militants on tactics developed during the Ukraine war, including on the use of drones. And apparently drones have been very huge in the HTS offensive, first on Aleppo, now on Hama. So the Kiev Post also cited a Ukrainian intelligence source who claimed the GRU's Klimnik group was responsible for the September 15th attack on a Russian military base outside of Aleppo. It was around that same time that Russian media reported that Ukraine has sent around 250 military specialists to Idlib to train extremist fighters. The Ukrainian military is training militants affiliated with the Turkmenistan Islamic Party, the TIP, under the command of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham for the use of drones and technologies to develop them, both with regard to the ability to increase flight speeds, photography, and targeting, a source told Sputnik on September 17th. So the Russians have been complaining about this for some time. TIP is a Uyghur-based militant group that was founded in Pakistan that seeks to create an Islamic state in China's Xinjiang province and has a branch in Syria. The Kiev Post mentioned the TIP is as one of the groups that the GRU has trained, and so that's very concerning. Now let's keep going through the stories here. We had this one from Jason Ditz on September 4th at antiwar.com. U.S. frames Syria attack airstrikes as self-defense despite happening amid ongoing U.S.-backed offensive. So Tuesday, the Kurdish SDF launched an offensive against a number of villages in eastern Syria. The U.S. backed the offensive with military action, and al-Mayadeen even suggested that the offensive itself came at the behest of the U.S. military. Today, we are getting some more details, and the U.S. is trying to reframe the narrative of what actually happened. It confirmed that the U.S. launched airstrikes as well as the previously reported artillery fire, which targeted Syrian forces in the area of the offensive. The strikes destroyed multiple trucks with rocket launcher systems on them and destroyed a T-64 battle tank. The strikes were launched specifically while the SDF offensive was ongoing, and it targeted forces in the area of the attacks. The Pentagon, however, has tried to present the strikes as, quote, self-defense, claiming that they present a that the presence of military assets in the area close to U.S. troops posed a clear and imminent threat. The Pentagon is trying to downplay the fact that it carried out airstrikes in support of the SDF trying to seize territory. Indeed, the official statement from CENTCOM leads heavily into the self-defense narrative and doesn't even mention there was an ongoing battle with SDF in the area. The small U.S.-held base in the part of eastern Syria are centered around oil and gas fields. The U.S. has helped the SDF seize those energy assets in 2017 after a brief occupation by Hamas. The Syrian government had expected to eventually recover those important economic assets, but the indication is the SDF intends to keep the area and intends to try to expand even further with these new attacks. All indications are that the U.S. is growing more interested in getting involved in the territorial grabs, particularly with Syria already vulnerable because the Islamist group HTS is gaining substantial territory further west. At the same time, the Pentagon wants to avoid directly admitting that what they are doing, just branding it as a typical self-defense action, despite plainly being related to the SDF offensive. And so this is, I think, a really big deal, and there's a couple reasons to it. One is the constitutional reason too, right? That they are claiming that these are self-defense strikes because that's what the Constitution, and not actually, right? Like, the Constitution doesn't say that you could put 900 troops in the middle of Syria, and if the Syrian troops go to chase out their American occupiers, that then we could claim self-defense and bomb those Syrian troops. But that is kind of how the Constitution has been interpreted over the past couple of decades. Now, what they're doing is they're encouraging the SDF to attack the Syrian army, and when the Syrian army fights back, they're bombing the Syrian army. And so this is not only having an impact and it's benefiting Al-Qaeda, because the Syrian army is now further distracted from their battle against Al-Qaeda, which, I mean, if I were in Washington right now, the most important thing that could be done is making sure that the terrorists, or at least making sure that the Americans, are not doing anything in Syria that is aiding the terrorists taking over Damascus, right? The worst thing for Americans that could possibly happen is that al-Jawlani, an Al-Qaeda guy, is the ruler of Syria. You know, a real Al-Qaeda state is bad for the American people. Al-Qaeda does not like the American people. Al-Qaeda jihadists will go to American concerts and fire on them. They will fly planes into our buildings. They will rent trucks and drive them through crowds of innocent civilians. These people are dangerous to the Americans. The Syrian army, Bashar al-Assad, doesn't care. He's never going to send anybody to America to kill Americans. He doesn't have missiles or planes or ships capable of hitting the U.S. Hell, he has allowed the U.S. to occupy like a third of his country. The Iranians aren't coming to the U.S. The Russians aren't coming to the U.S. Hezbollah, the Houthis, they're not coming to the U.S. The only threat to Americans is from HTS, and that's who the U.S. is effectively backing in Syria. All right. Next up here, let's go to this one from Jason Ditz on December 5th. Al-Qaeda-linked militants seize major Syrian city of Hama. So just a week after taking Aleppo, the Syrian Islamists led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, have seized another major city. This time they have taken Hama, Syria's fourth largest city, which had not fallen during the previously during the protracted Syrian civil war. Senior commanders for HTS forces said tanks were used in the assault and that hundreds of unjustly imprisoned individuals were freed from Hama Central Prison. So Al-Qaeda got some of their Al-Qaeda fighters back now. So last week, HTS and its allies stoked apprehension when they seized the northern city of Aleppo, the nation's second largest. The Syrian army has tried to slow their advance with counterattacks, but so far has had limited success. The army confirmed it had redeployed out of Hama after reports of intense fighting, saying it wanted to avoid exposing civilians to battles. The army statement also reported suffering heavy losses. The HTS offensive has been strongly backed by Turkish rebels from the country's northwest. There have been multiple reports that Turkey is backing the offensive, and indeed, Turkey may even be the driving force behind the recent push. HTS fighters seem increasingly well equipped and confirmed as using tanks in their assault on Hama. With Hama taken, many analysts say their next major target will be the city of Homs, that being an obvious next step as HTS continues their offensive south along the major M5 highway from Aleppo. Homs is just 25 miles south of Hama. If Homs fell too, it's likely the capital of Damascus could be under a major risk. Senior HTS commanders have made online posts announcing their gains, and one of the posts called on residents to Homs to rise up in revolution. HTS leader Abu Mohammed al-Jolani has also released a video statement threatening to expand the war into Iraq if the Iraqi militia coalition Hashad al-Tashabi gets involved. And these are the Shia militias of Iraq. And so, he's basically kind of threatening here to reimpose the Baghdadi policy, the ISIS policy of, erasing the Iraq and Syrian border and trying to create an Islamic caliphate that stretches across the Levant. The reports earlier this week that the Hashad al-Shabi, or the Popular Mobilization Forces, is another name for them, but the Iraqi Shia militia fighters had already entered Syria, though this was ultimately denied. The coalition of Shia militias is substantial and would make sense that they would fight that they might bat the Syrian government against the Sunni Islamist factions. The HTS was a creation of the merger of several Islamist factions, most notably Jabhat al-Nusra, which was al-Qaeda's Syria-affiliated group. Though HTS has publicly disavowed al-Qaeda in an attempt to be more palatable to the West, they retain the same ideology. And so, these are who these people are. All right, I think this might be our last article today. U.S. military says it intercepted Houthi attacks on U.S. commercial vessels. So this is from Dave DeCamp, Anti-War, December 2nd. On Sunday, U.S. Central Command said U.S. Navy destroyers intercepted missiles and drones launched by Yemen's Houthis at 3 U.S. commercial vessels in the Gulf of Aden. CENTCOM said in a press release, U.S. destroyers, the USS Stockdale and the USS O'Kane, successfully defended a range of Houthi-launched weapons targeting weapons while transiting the Gulf of Aden. The Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, took credit for the attack, saying they targeted 3 U.S. supply ships and 1 destroyer. According to Al-Mayadeen, the Houthi military spokesperson Yasha Sharia said the Yemeni forces carried out precise hits, but CENTCOM said there was no damage or injuries. Typically, the Houthis are the ones to kind of make up that they're hitting American ships, and the American denials are probably accurate that an American ship wasn't hit by the Houthis there. but that war is still going on and is a struggle and costly for the Americans is important and worth noting. All right, now this is the actual last article today. I just want to mention, we're not going to go through this one in detail, but just to mention that while the U.S. claims that the ceasefire is still holding between Lebanon, Israel, Israel and Hezbollah, that Israel has violated that ceasefire over 100 times and continues to carry out daily rocket and airstrikes against southern Lebanon, often killing civilians. And so it's really not a ceasefire yet. We will see if anything develops over the weekend, but it does seem like the fighting is set to re-escalate in Lebanon with the repeated Israeli violations of that ceasefire. All right, everyone, that's where I'm wrapping up the show for today. Thank you all so much for tuning into everything I had going on this week, whether it was conflicts of interest or the Kyle Anzalone show. If you haven't already, take that second, go click that link in the top of the show notes page, and take those like 30 seconds to hit subscribe on the Kyle Anzalone show for me. I really appreciate it. And if you haven't yet, watch one of those episodes of the show. I think you will really enjoy it. Thanks, everyone.